The sun in Plano, Texas, doesn't just shine, it actively assaults you. It was mid-August, a blistering 105 degrees in the shade, and the humidity was thick enough that you could practically chew the air. I was standing in the middle of my perfectly manicured, HOA-approved backyard, sweating straight through my faded gray t-shirt, staring down at a $40 piece of extruded plastic. It was a kiddie pool. A blue, vinyl, inflatable ring of salvation that I had just purchased from a big box store filled with lukewarm tap water from the garden hose. Next to it was Buster, my golden retriever, panting so hard his entire body vibrated. He sounded like a broken lawnmower. I had just cracked open an ice-cold domestic beer, ready to dip my feet into the glorious ankle-deep water when I heard the unmistakable squeak of orthotics on my driveway. I didn't even have to turn around. I knew that squeak. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that squeak. It belonged to Richard. Richard was the president of the Oak Creek Meadows Homeowners Association. He was a man who seemed to derive all his life's joy from making sure other people had absolutely none. He was short, perfectly spherical, and perpetually dressed in khaki shorts that were far too tight, paired with a tucked-in polo shirt. But his defining feature, his absolute weapon of choice, was the clipboard he carried everywhere. It was silver aluminum, heavily scratched, and always loaded with carbon copy citation forms. He came marching through my side gate without knocking, his face flushed red from the heat and the sheer thrill of enforcing suburban law. "Jack!" he barked, coming to a dead halt at the edge of my patio. He didn't say hello. He didn't comment on the weather. He just pointed a stubby, accusatory finger at my blue vinyl oasis. "What is that?" I took a slow sip of my beer, letting the condensation drip down my knuckles. "It's a pool, Richard. Well, technically it's a puddle with walls, but Buster appreciates it." Buster let out a low woof and dropped his chin onto the inflated rim, looking pathetic. Richard did not care about Buster. Richard only cared about the bylaws. He whipped out his reading glasses, letting them hang on the croquis around his neck, and tapped his pen against the metal clipboard. It made a sharp, annoying pinging sound. "You know the rules, Jack. Bylaw 4B clearly states, no temporary, above-ground, or inflatable water containment vessels are permitted on the exterior of the property at any time." "Richard," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "It is 105 degrees outside. It is a heat wave. The asphalt is literally melting out front. I put this up 10 minutes ago so my dog doesn't get heat stroke." "Rules are rules, Jack," he said, puffing his chest out. He was actually enjoying this. I could see the little gleam of power tripping in his beady eyes. "If I let you have a plastic pool, next thing you know, the Henderson family will want one. Then the Millers. Before you know it, our property values will plummet because the whole neighborhood will look like a trailer park." "It's 3 feet wide," I shot back, taking a step toward him. "You can't even see it from the street over the 6-foot privacy fence you made me install last year." "Doesn't matter. It's on the exterior of the property. It's a violation." He started scribbling furiously on his neon green pad. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper was like nails on a chalkboard. "I'm issuing a citation, $500, and you have until sundown to drain it and remove it from the premises. If I drive by tomorrow and this eyesore is still here, the fine doubles." I stared at him. A $500 fine for a $40 kiddie pool. It was extortion, wrapped up in a polo shirt and khaki shorts. I looked down at Buster, who was now happily lapping up the water, splashing it all over the grass. I looked back at Richard. He ripped the top copy of the citation off the pad and held it out to me. The paper was literally neon green, designed to be as obnoxious and visible as possible. I didn't take it. I just let it flutter to the patio table next to my beer. "Drain it, Jack," Richard warned, adjusting his glasses. "I'll be checking." With that, he turned on his heel and marched back out the gate, his orthotics squeaking the whole way down the driveway. I stood there for a long time in the blinding heat, just staring at the neon green slip of paper. My blood was boiling, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the Texas sun. I grabbed the edge of the kiddie pool, flipped it over, and dumped the water onto the grass. Buster let out a whine of protest. I rolled up the wet plastic, shoved it into the trash can, and walked into my house. The blast of air conditioning hit me like a physical wall, but it didn't cool me down. I was furious. I paced around my kitchen, drinking a glass of ice water, muttering to myself. The sheer arrogance of the man, the absolute unchecked power of a bored retiree with a clipboard. I walked over to the basement door and opened it. When I bought this house a year ago, the main selling point wasn't the pristine landscaping or the granite countertops in the kitchen. It was the basement. In Texas, basements are rare because of the limestone and the clay soil. But this house sat on a weird geographic anomaly, a slight elevation that allowed the original builder to dig deep. I had a massive 1,500 square foot, completely unfinished concrete cavern under my house. It was just raw, poured concrete walls, exposed wooden floor joists above, and a few load-bearing steel pillars holding up the main floor. I had planned to turn it into a home theater or a massive game room eventually, but for now, it was just empty, echoing space. I stood at the top of the wooden stairs, looking down into the cool darkness. A thought started to form in my mind. A tiny, ridiculous, incredibly petty thought. Bylaw 4B. No temporary, above-ground, or inflatable water containment vessels are permitted on the exterior of the property. He had emphasized exterior. I walked over to my home office, booted up my laptop, and pulled up the Oak Creek Meadows HOA bylaws. I had a digital copy saved from when I bought the place. I hit Control F and searched for the word pool. There it was. Page 42. A massive block of text detailing exactly what kind of in-ground pools were allowed, only if built by approved contractors, matching the aesthetic of the neighborhood, surrounded by specific wrought iron fencing, and explicitly banning anything above ground. I read it 3 times. The entire section was meticulously focused on the visual impact of the neighborhood. It was all about the yard, the exterior, the property lines, the street view. There was absolutely nothing in the bylaws about what a homeowner could do inside their own home regarding water. I leaned back in my office chair, steepling my fingers. Okay, Richard wanted to play lawyer. We could play lawyer. But if I was going to do this, I couldn't just build a swimming pool in my basement. If I tried to build a traditional pool, the city would require permits for a residential swimming pool. The HOA would find out, and they'd find some vague clause about altering the residential nature of the dwelling to stop me. I needed an ironclad, foolproof, legally untouchable reason to have a massive body of water inside my house. I opened a new tab and typed in Texas Property Code HOA Restrictions. I started digging. Texas is a state that loves private property rights, but HOAs have historically had a terrifying amount of power here. However, over the years, the state legislature had passed a few laws to rein them in. I read through statutes about flag displays, solar panels, and religious items. And then I found it. The holy grail of malicious compliance. Texas Property Code, Title 11, Chapter 2, 102, Section 202.007. I read the text on the screen, my heart beating faster. The statute was titled, Certain Covenants Restricting Rainwater. Harvesting Systems and Water Storage Systems Prohibited. The law was designed for drought resilience. It explicitly stated that a property owners association may not include or enforce a provision in a dedicatory instrument that prohibits or restricts a property owner from installing rain barrels, rainwater harvesting systems, or water storage systems for domestic use. The law stated the HOA could only regulate the aesthetics if the system was visible from the street, but they absolutely could not ban the system entirely. I stared at the words, water storage systems. It wasn't a pool. A pool is for swimming. A pool is a luxury. What I was going to build was an emergency indoor drought resilience water storage cistern. It just so happened that my emergency cistern was going to be 1,500 square feet, filled with 50,000 gallons of crystal clear water and deep enough to require a diving board. The fact that I might occasionally float in my cistern on an inflatable flamingo was legally irrelevant. It was a domestic water storage facility, protected by the great state of Texas. I printed out the statute. I held the warm paper in my hands and laughed out loud. The sound echoed in the empty house. Richard had wanted a war over a $40 kiddie pool. I was going to give him an aquatic apocalypse. First thing the next morning, I was on the phone. I didn't need a pool guy. Pool guys ask too many questions and pull the wrong kind of permits. I needed a structural contractor, someone who dealt with heavy loads, waterproofing, and commercial-grade concrete. I called 3 places before I found Tommy. Tommy ran a foundation and commercial concrete repair company out of Dallas. When he showed up at my house later that afternoon, he rolled up in a lifted, battered Ford F-250. He was a grizzled guy in his 50s, wearing a high-vis shirt covered in concrete dust, heavily calloused hands, and a disposition that suggested he had zero time for anyone's nonsense. I led him straight down to the basement and flipped on the overhead utility lights. Tommy stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking around the massive, dusty space. He kicked one of the steel load-bearing pillars with the toe of his work boot. "All right, buddy, you got a lot of square footage down here. You want a massive man cave? Want me to frame it out, put up some drywall, pour a leveling compound? What's the job?" I crossed my arms. "Tommy, I need you to waterproof this entire basement. I'm talking floor-to-ceiling marine-grade epoxy. I need you to reinforce every single load-bearing pillar with steel sleeves, seal the foundational seams, and build a 3-foot concrete retaining wall around the stairwell to keep water from flooding up into the main house." Tommy slowly turned his head to look at me. He had a pinch of chewing tobacco in his lower lip, and he shifted it thoughtfully. "You want to waterproof the whole thing? To the ceiling?" "Yes." "Why?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. "Because," I said, deadpan, "I am going to fill this entire basement with 50,000 gallons of water." Tommy stopped chewing. He stared at me for a solid 10 seconds. He looked around the room again, calculating the volume in his head. He looked back at me. He walked over to a bucket in the corner, spit a dark stream of tobacco juice into it, and walked back. "I charge double for crazy," Tommy said flatly. "I'll pay it," I replied without missing a beat. "But there's a catch. When you pull the permit with the city of Plano, you cannot, under any circumstances, use the word pool. You are pulling a structural modification permit for an interior emergency water storage cistern. I will handle the plumbing and the filtration, but you are building me a concrete water tank that just happens to be the exact shape and size of my foundation." Tommy let out a sharp, barking laugh. It sounded like a chainsaw starting up. "An interior cistern. Buddy, the city inspectors are going to have a stroke when they see the plans. Let them. It's legal under Texas property code. I just need you to make sure the water doesn't collapse my house into a sinkhole. Oh, I can make it hold, Tommy said, tapping the concrete wall. I'll need to bring in heavy steel. We'll have to trench the floor to install main drains and return lines before we pour a secondary slab over the original. We're going to use an industrial polyurea coating, same stuff they use in municipal water towers. It'll be bulletproof, but it's going to be loud, it's going to be messy, and it's going to cost you a small fortune. Give me the quote, I said. 2 days later, the quote hit my inbox. It was staggering. I could have bought a very nice luxury sedan for what Tommy wanted to charge me. But as I looked out my kitchen window and saw Richard pacing the sidewalk across the street, scrutinizing my neighbor's lawn with his clipboard in hand, I didn't even hesitate. I digitally signed the contract and wired Tommy the 50% deposit. You can't put a price tag on spite. The construction started the following Monday, and I made sure it was as highly visible as legally possible. Tommy's crew arrived at 7 a.m. sharp. 3 massive diesel-guzzling work trucks roared into my driveway, loaded down with steel I-beams, bags of Portland cement, and heavy machinery. The noise was glorious. Concrete saws fired up, screaming through the morning air as they began trenching my basement floor. The vibration rattled the teacups in my kitchen cabinets. It took exactly 45 minutes for Richard to show up. I was sitting on my front porch, drinking coffee, watching Tommy's guys haul bags of concrete mix through my front door. Richard came marching across my lawn, completely ignoring the paved walkway, his face a mask of righteous indignation. "Jack!" he yelled over the roar of a masonry saw echoing from inside the house. "What is the meaning of this? What kind of unapproved construction are you running here?" I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Morning, Richard. Beautiful day, isn't it? Much cooler today. Only 95. "Don't play games with me," he snapped, waving his clipboard. "I didn't approve any exterior modifications to this property. I haven't seen an architectural review form. I haven't seen a permit notice. You have unauthorized commercial vehicles on the property." "First of all, Richard," I said, raising my voice to be heard over the noise, "the vehicles are parked in my driveway, which is allowed under the bylaws during active home maintenance. Second, there are no exterior modifications happening. Everything is entirely internal. Therefore, the HOA has absolutely zero jurisdiction over what I am doing." Richard's eyes darted to the front door, trying to get a look inside, but a large man carrying a steel pipe blocked his view. "Internal modifications of this scale require permits," Richard insisted, his voice cracking slightly. "I know for a fact you're altering the structural integrity. What are you building? Are you trying to knock down load-bearing walls? Because that affects the structural soundness of the entire neighborhood's aesthetic profile." "That literally makes no sense, Richard," I laughed. "But if you must know, I am doing some vital structural upgrades to my foundation and installing an emergency preparation system in my basement. It's fully permitted by the city of Plano. You can go down to the permit office and look it up yourself if you want to waste your afternoon." Richard glared at me, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You mark my words, Jack. I am going to find out what you're doing, and if you step one toe over the line of the bylaws, I will bury you in fines. I will put a lien on this house so fast it'll make your head spin." "Have a great day, Richard," I smiled, lifting my coffee mug to him. He stormed off, kicking a stray pebble into the street. I watched him go, a deep, settling calm washing over me. He had no idea. He couldn't even comprehend the sheer scale of the malicious compliance that was currently being constructed beneath my living room floor. For the next 3 weeks, my house was a war zone. Tommy and his crew worked like madmen. They trenched the concrete floor, laying massive PVC pipes for a high-volume filtration system that I had ordered separately. They erected a secondary steel frame against the outer walls of the basement to reinforce the foundation against the immense lateral pressure of 50,000 gallons of water. They poured a new, heavily reinforced concrete slab over the floor, pitching it perfectly toward the two massive main drains. The most impressive part was the waterproofing. They brought in a specialized rig to spray the industrial polyurea coating. It went on hot, smelling like burning plastic and chemicals, curing instantly into a thick, rubberized armor that bonded to the concrete. They sprayed the floors, the walls, and even the steel pillars up to the 10-foot mark. My basement transformed from a dusty concrete cave into a seamless, pale blue, waterproof vault. I handled the logistics of the water storage equipment. I had a commercial-grade pool pump, an enormous sand filter, and a high-efficiency electric heater delivered on pallets. I had the delivery guys leave them right in the driveway for a few hours before moving them inside, just to let Richard see the massive cardboard boxes. I knew he was spying from his living room window with binoculars. I could practically feel his blood pressure spiking. I had an electrician come out and wire the entire system on a dedicated sub-panel, installing the equipment in a small utility closet I had Tommy frame out near the stairs, completely sealed off from the main water tank area. Finally, they built the retaining wall at the top of the stairs, a 3-foot-high reinforced concrete dam with a heavy watertight marine door built into it. You had to open the submarine-style door to walk down the stairs into the basement. It was a masterpiece of over-engineering. On a Friday afternoon, Tommy stood with me at the top of the stairs, looking down into the massive pale blue cavern. The work lights reflected off the rubberized floor. "Well, buddy," Tommy said, wiping sweat from his forehead with a dirty rag. "She's done. Holds a vacuum seal. Plumbing is pressure tested. You've got the most secure indoor cistern in the state of Texas. You could survive a nuclear winter down there." "It's perfect, Tommy," I said, handing him the final check. He looked at the amount, folded it, and put it in his front pocket. "I don't know who you're trying to piss off, Jack, but I almost feel sorry for them. Good luck with the water bill." The water bill. That was the final piece of the puzzle. I couldn't just turn on my garden hose and let it run for a month to fill 50,000 gallons. The city would flag my meter, the pressure would be terrible, and it would take forever. I needed this done quickly and dramatically. I went back to my office and made one last phone call. I called a commercial bulk water delivery service out of Fort Worth, the kind of company that fills municipal swimming pools and agricultural tanks. "I need 50,000 gallons of treated potable water delivered to a residential address in Plano," I told the dispatcher. 50,000? That's a lot of trucks, sir. We usually use 6,000-gallon tankers. That's going to take about 8 or 9 truckloads." "Send them all," I said. "And I need them there bright and early. Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. Saturday morning arrived with a stillness that only exists in the suburbs before the sun decides to turn the air into a microwave. It was 5:50 a.m. I was already awake, sitting on my front porch step with a mug of black coffee, watching the horizon turn a bruised shade of purple. The neighborhood was dead quiet. The only sound was the occasional chirp of a confused bird and the low, distant hum of air conditioning units working overtime. Honestly, I was vibrating with anticipation. I mean, you spend a small fortune waterproof sealing your foundation and you just kind of want to see the payoff, I guess. At exactly 5:58 a.m., the silence was shattered. It started as a low rumble, a deep, guttural vibration that you could feel in your molars before you could actually hear it. Then, turning the corner onto Oak Creek Drive, came the first truck. It was a massive 18-wheel Peterbilt tanker, polished chrome gleaming in the streetlights, towing a massive stainless steel cylinder. It hissed and groaned as it shifted gears, its diesel engine echoing off the manicured two-story houses like a foghorn in a canyon. And right behind it was another one. And another one. Like literally a convoy of 9 commercial water tankers was rolling down my quiet, strictly regulated, 25-mile-per-hour residential street. They looked like they were arriving to put out a forest fire, not deliver to a single-family home. The lead driver pulled up to my curb, the air brakes releasing with a deafening pshh that probably woke up people 3 zip codes away. The truck idled loudly, the massive engine block rumbling. The driver, a guy wearing a faded baseball cap and a reflective vest, rolled down his window and leaned out, holding a clipboard. "Jack?" he shouted over the engine noise. "That's me," I yelled back, walking down the driveway. "I got 50,000 gallons of treated municipal water here. Where do you want the drop?" "Right through the front door," I pointed to the house. The driver blinked, staring at me for a second. "You want me to run the discharge hose into your living room?" "Technically, down the hallway and into the basement," I corrected him. "Don't worry, the pathway is prepped. Just hook it up." The driver shrugged. He didn't get paid to ask questions. He hopped out of the cab and started unspooling a massive 6-inch diameter canvas fire hose from the side of the tanker. The other trucks pulled up along the curb behind him, forming a solid wall of industrial machinery that completely blocked my house, and Richard's house, and the house next to that. I left the front door wide open. I had laid down heavy-duty rubber mats over the hardwood floors in the entryway and hallway, just in case of any drips. The driver dragged the heavy brass nozzle of the hose through my front door, down the hall, and paused at the top of the basement stairs. He looked down into the massive, blue, empty cavern. "Holy mother of," he muttered, pulling his hat off and scratching his head. "You building a submarine base down here, buddy?" "Drought resilience," I said with a straight face. "You know how unpredictable the Texas grid is." He just laughed, shook his head, and hauled the hose over the concrete retaining wall, letting the nozzle drop down onto the polyurea-coated floor below. "All right, boss. Give me the thumbs up when you're clear, and I'll open the main valve." I walked back out to the front yard, just in time to see the show begin. The front door of Richard's house across the street flew open so hard it bounced off the exterior siding. Richard came sprinting out, and when I say sprinting, I mean a frantic, panicked waddle. He was wearing a plush, navy blue bathrobe, black dress socks pulled halfway up his calves, and no shoes. He was clutching his silver clipboard like a shield. His hair was sticking up in tufts on the sides of his head. He looked like a very angry, disheveled owl. "Stop!" Richard screamed, waving his arms frantically at the lead truck driver, who was currently wrestling a massive wrench to open the tanker's discharge valve. "Cease this immediately!" The driver ignored him, throwing his weight against the wrench. Richard abandoned the driver and sprinted across the street, his dress socks slipping slightly on the dewy asphalt. He marched right up to me, his chest heaving, his face contorted in a mix of rage and utter bewilderment. "Jack!" he gasped, pointing a trembling finger at the wall of tankers. "What? What is this? What are you doing? This is a residential neighborhood. You cannot have commercial vehicles of this tonnage parked on the street, and you certainly cannot have them dumping liquid onto your property." Bylaw 12C clearly prohibits the storage or dumping of any bulk materials, including soils, gravel, or liquids, on the exterior of the property. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. "Morning, Richard. You're up early. Like I told you before, they aren't dumping anything on the exterior of the property, so Bylaw 12C doesn't apply." Richard sputtered, his eyes darting from the tanker truck to the massive hose snaking across my manicured lawn, up the porch steps, and into my open front door. His jaw actually dropped. He literally could not process what he was looking at. They are pumping it into your house?" he whispered, horrified. That is correct, I said cheerfully. You're flooding your own house? Are you insane? Do you have any idea what kind of structural damage you're doing? The mold! The foundation! This is a hazard to the entire community. I'm calling the city. I'm calling the police. You do whatever you feel is necessary, Richard, I said, leaning back against the brick facade of my house. But I'd recommend you put some shoes on first. The asphalt is going to get hot. Right at that moment, the truck driver yelled, "Opening the valve!" A massive clunk echoed from the tanker, followed by the sound of rushing water. The canvas hose lying across my lawn suddenly violently inflated, jerking and twisting like a massive anaconda waking up. It swelled to 6 inches in diameter, rigid with the pressure of thousands of gallons of water rushing through it per minute. The sound was incredible. Inside the house, I could hear the deep, echoing roar of the water blasting out of the nozzle and hitting the concrete floor of the basement. It sounded like Niagara Falls had been relocated to my living room. Richard stared at the swollen hose, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fury. "I am shutting this down," he hissed, backing away. "I am shutting this down today, Jack. You have lost your mind." He turned and practically sprinted back across the street, his bathrobe flapping in the wind. I just smiled, turned around, and walked back inside to watch the show. Standing at the top of the basement stairs, behind the concrete retaining wall, the sheer volume of noise was deafening. The water was blasting out of the hose with terrifying force, foaming and frothing as it hit the blue polyurea coating and began to spread across the 1,500-square-foot floor. It was crystal clear, clean municipal water. Because the floor was pitched slightly toward the main drains, it began to pool in the center first, slowly creeping outward toward the walls. It takes a remarkably long time to fill 50,000 gallons of space, even with a commercial pump. I pulled up a folding chair at the top of the stairs, opened a fresh box of donuts I had bought the night before, and just watched. Honestly, it was hypnotic. I mean, the water level rose so slowly you almost couldn't see it happening, but the acoustics of the room began to change. The sharp, echoing roar of the initial blast started to muffle as the water got deeper. The air in the house started to change too. It felt cooler, heavier, with that distinct, clean smell of a massive body of fresh water. By 8 a.m., the first truck was empty. The driver unhooked the hose, pulled forward, and the second truck backed into position to hook up. The water level in the basement was now about 8 inches deep, a massive, perfectly still mirror reflecting the exposed wooden joists of the ceiling above. By 10 a.m., we were on truck number 5. The water was up to my waist if I were standing in it. The sheer weight of it was immense, but Tommy's engineering was flawless. There were no creaks, no groans from the foundation. The polyurea coating was holding perfectly. I spent the time setting up the aesthetics. I mean, if you're going to have a 50,000-gallon cistern, it shouldn't look like a dungeon. I had ordered 24 heavy-duty waterproof LED smart lights. I started tossing them into the water. They sank to the bottom, heavy weighted bases keeping them upright. I pulled out my phone, opened the app, and turned them on. The entire basement suddenly glowed with a deep, vibrant, electric blue light. It illuminated the water from below, casting dancing, rippling reflections all over the concrete walls and the wooden ceiling. It looked like a high-end luxury resort had been secretly built under my floorboards. It was breathtaking. By 1 p.m., the 9th and final truck was pumping the last of its payload. The water level had reached its maximum height. 5.5 feet deep, across the entire 1,500 square foot footprint. The water stopped a few inches below the rim of the concrete retaining wall I was standing behind. The final truck driver came to the front door, wiping his hands on a rag. He peeked down the hallway. "All done, boss. You want to sign the manifest?" I walked over, signed the clipboard, and handed it back to him. "Thanks for the delivery." "Hey," he said, lowering his voice. "I don't know what you're doing down there, but that looks incredible." "Just storing some water," I smiled. After the trucks finally rumbled away, leaving the street eerily quiet again, I went to work on the final touches. I went to the utility closet we had built, flipped the heavy breaker switches, and turned on the commercial pump and the filtration system. The system hummed to life with a deep, satisfying vibration. Within seconds, the two massive main drains at the bottom of the basement began pulling water, sending it through the sand filter and blasting it back out through 6 return jets installed along the walls. The perfectly still surface of the water suddenly rippled, creating a gentle, continuous current that circulated the entire volume. I dumped in the precise amount of chlorine and balancing chemicals, letting the jets mix it into the system. It was done. It was perfect. It was time for the inaugural test. I went up to my bedroom, changed into a pair of bright floral swim trunks, and grabbed the giant, inflatable pink flamingo I had purchased specifically for this moment. I carried the deflated plastic bird downstairs, plugged in a small air compressor, and blew it up right there in the hallway. I went to the kitchen, grabbed a blender, and mixed up a massive, frozen margarita. I poured it into a plastic tumbler, salted the rim, and walked back to the top of the basement stairs. I opened the heavy marine door in the concrete retaining wall. The air that hit me was cool, humid, and smelled faintly of chlorine. The exact smell of a summer vacation. The electric blue LEDs under the water made the whole cavern glow. I tossed the giant pink flamingo over the wall. It landed with a soft splash, bobbing gently on the surface of my indoor lake. I climbed over the retaining wall, stepping onto the top stair, and slowly walked down into the water. It was freezing. It was municipal water that had been sitting in metal tanks, but I didn't care. I waded out until the water was up to my chest. The sheer scale of it was mind-bending. I was standing inside my own house, underneath my living room, in a body of water large enough to do laps in. I waded over to the flamingo, hauled myself up onto it, and settled into the plastic seat. I floated there in the center of the basement, the gentle current from the return jets slowly spinning me in circles. The blue light rippled on the ceiling above me. The hum of the pump was a white noise lullaby. I took a sip of my margarita. It was tart, freezing, and tasted like absolute victory. I was literally just floating there, staring at a steel load-bearing pillar, wondering if I should buy a waterproof television to mount on the concrete wall, when I heard the heavy, urgent pounding on my front door upstairs. Bam! 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 "Plano Police Department! Open the door!" I sighed, took another sip of my margarita, and paddled the flamingo toward the stairs. I guess Richard actually followed through. I climbed out of the water, leaving a trail of wet footprints on the concrete stairs, stepped over the retaining wall, and secured the marine door. I was dripping wet, wearing floral trunks, holding a margarita, and shivering slightly as the air conditioning hit my wet skin. I walked down the hallway and pulled open the front door. Standing on my porch were 2 police officers. One was older, graying at the temples, looking incredibly bored and exhausted by the heat. The other was younger, looking tense, with his hand resting near his radio. Parked on the street behind them was a patrol cruiser, lights flashing. And standing on the sidewalk, a safe distance away, was Richard. He was fully dressed now, clutching his clipboard, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. "Can I help you, officers?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. The older officer looked me up and down, taking in the wet swim trunks, the bare feet, and the salted margarita glass. He let out a long, slow exhale. "Are you Jack?" "I am." "Jack, we received a frantic call from your HOA president over there." The officer hooked a thumb toward Richard. "He stated that you have been pumping tens of thousands of gallons of water directly into your home. He claimed you were intentionally flooding the property, causing an imminent structural collapse hazard to the neighborhood, and possibly running an illegal commercial water park." I couldn't help it. I laughed. "A commercial water park? Seriously?" The younger officer peered past me, looking down the hallway. "Sir, your floors are dry up here, but we need to ensure you aren't creating a public safety hazard. Did you pump water into this house?" "I did," I said calmly. "I had a permitted structural indoor cistern installed for drought resilience, and I had it filled today. Everything is completely legal and built to code." "An indoor cistern," the older officer repeated, deadpan. "Sir, I'm going to need you to show us this cistern. Because if you just ran a hose into your basement, the fire department is going to have to come condemn this structure." "Not a problem. Come on in. Just watch your step. The hardwood is a little slippery right here." I stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. The two officers walked in, their heavy boots thudding on the rubber mats I had laid down. They followed me down the hallway to the utility closet first. I opened the door. "This is the filtration and circulation system," I said, pointing to the massive sand filter, the commercial pump, and the heater. "Wired by a licensed electrician on an isolated subpanel." The younger officer looked at the equipment, then looked at me. "That's pool equipment." "It's water purification equipment for a storage system," I corrected him smoothly. "Gotta keep the emergency supply potable, right?" I shut the utility door and led them to the top of the basement stairs. I unlatched the heavy marine door on the retaining wall and swung it open, revealing the massive, glowing blue cavern below. The two officers stepped up to the edge and looked down. For a solid 10 seconds, nobody said a word. The only sound was the gentle sloshing of the water against the concrete walls and the low hum of the return jets. The giant pink flamingo slowly floated past the stairs, bobbing in the current. The older officer took his hat off and wiped his forehead. He stared at the sheer expanse of water, the polyurea coating, the reinforced steel pillars, and the underwater LED lighting. "Sweet, merciful heaven," the older officer whispered. The younger officer leaned over the wall, his eyes wide. Is that deep enough to swim in?" 5.5 feet across the board," I said, taking a sip of my drink. "And the lights?" "Smart LEDs. I can change them to red if I'm feeling dramatic." The older officer turned to look at me, his face a mixture of utter disbelief and profound respect. "You built a 50,000-gallon swimming pool inside your basement." "Technically," I said, raising a finger, "I built an emergency drought resilience water storage cistern. It is explicitly protected under Texas Property Code Section 202.007. The state law prohibits any homeowners association from restricting the installation of a water storage system for domestic use. I pulled the permits with the city of Plano last month. The structure was engineered by a licensed commercial foundation company, and the polyurea coating is municipal grade. I reached over to a small table near the stairs, picked up a manila folder, and handed it to the officer. Here are the signed city permits, the structural engineering sign-offs, and a printed copy of the state statute. The older officer didn't even open the folder. He just held it, staring at the giant pink flamingo floating in the glowing blue water. He started to chuckle. It started as a low rumble in his chest and grew into a full belly laugh. He leaned against the doorframe, shaking his head. "So," the officer said, catching his breath. "The guy on the sidewalk. Let me guess. He wouldn't let you put up a little plastic pool in the backyard? He fined me $500 for a $40 kiddie pool because it violated a bylaw about exterior water containment." I smiled. "So, I complied with the exterior rule." The younger officer was grinning now, shaking his head. "This is the most incredible thing I have ever seen on a domestic call. How much did this cost you?" "More than my first car, less than a divorce," I replied. "So, are we good here, gentlemen? No public safety hazards?" "Sir," the older officer said, handing the folder back to me, "as far as I'm concerned, you are a model citizen preparing for the next Texas drought. Your structural permits are in order. Your property is secure. This is entirely a civil matter between you and your very, very angry HOA president." The cops turned around and walked back down the hallway. I followed them out to the front porch. Richard was still standing on the sidewalk, practically foaming at the mouth, waiting for them to drag me out in handcuffs. When the officers walked out, smiling and relaxed, Richard's face fell. He hurried forward. "Well?" Richard demanded. "Did you see it? Are you arresting him? Are you calling the fire marshal?" The older officer stopped on the front walk, hooking his thumbs into his duty belt. He looked at Richard with the distinct expression of a man who dealt with too much nonsense on a daily basis. "Sir, we have inspected the interior of the property," the officer said loudly, ensuring the neighbors who were peeking out of their windows could hear. "The homeowner has installed a fully permitted, structurally sound, legally protected emergency water storage system. There are no laws being broken. There is no public hazard, and there is absolutely nothing for the police to do here." Richard looked like he had been struck by lightning. "A water storage system? He had 9 tanker trucks. He's flooding his house. He has a swimming pool in his basement." "He has a cistern, sir," the younger officer corrected him, struggling to keep a straight face. "And quite frankly, it's a very impressive piece of engineering. Have a good day, gentlemen." The officers got into their cruiser. As the older officer rolled his window up, he looked at me and yelled, "Hey, Jack, do me a favor and text me the name of your contractor. My brother-in-law does foundation work. He's got to see this." I gave him a thumbs up. The cruiser pulled away, turning off its flashing lights. I was left standing on my porch, holding my margarita, looking down at Richard. He was staring at me, his chest heaving, his face a blotchy, dangerous red. He looked down at his clipboard, then back up at me. "This isn't over," Richard hissed, his voice trembling with absolute fury. "You think you're clever, playing word games with the police. But you aren't dealing with the police anymore. You are dealing with the Oak Creek Meadows Homeowners Association. I am calling an emergency board meeting for this Tuesday. I am bringing our legal counsel. I am going to draft a fine so massive it will bankrupt you, and I will force you to drain that entire basement at your own expense." He pointed his pen at me like a weapon. "Tuesday night, Jack. 8 p.m. at the community center. You better bring your checkbook." He turned and stormed back across the street, his orthotics squeaking furiously against the pavement. I watched him go, taking a slow, cold sip of my drink. Honestly, I couldn't wait for Tuesday. I went back inside, locked the front door, and headed straight back down to the basement. The water was calling my name. I climbed back over the retaining wall, slipped into the freezing electric blue water, and swam a lazy lap from one concrete wall to the other. Let Richard call his lawyer. Let him bring his board members. Let him draft whatever fines he wanted. He was fighting a war based on neighborhood bylaws, and I was holding the nuclear launch keys of the Texas state legislature. I paddled back over to the Pink Flamingo, climbed on, and closed my eyes, listening to the hum of the filtration system. Tuesday was going to be a bloodbath, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. Tuesday night rolled around, and honestly, the tension in the air was thicker than the Texas humidity. The Oak Creek Meadows Community Center was a depressing little beige stucco building sitting at the edge of the neighborhood, smelling permanently of stale Folgers coffee, lemon pledge, and the crushing weight of suburban mediocrity. Usually, the monthly board meetings drew a crowd of maybe 4 people, and 3 of them were just there for the free powdered donuts. But tonight? Literally, there were cars parked halfway down the street. It was standing room only. The rumor mill had been absolutely churning since Saturday morning. You can't parade 9 commercial tanker trucks through a quiet subdivision without people talking. The neighborhood Facebook group had apparently descended into complete chaos. Some people thought I was running an illegal commercial bottling plant. Some thought I was prepping for the apocalypse. One lady, God bless her, was absolutely convinced I had discovered a geothermal hot spring under my foundation and was opening a day spa. I walked through the double glass doors right at 7:55 p.m., holding nothing but an ice-cold can of sparkling water and a thin manila folder. The chatter in the room instantly died. It was like I had walked into a saloon in an old Western movie. 80 pairs of eyes just locked onto me. I mean, people were literally leaning around concrete pillars just to get a look at the guy who flooded his own house. I took a sip of my water, gave a little wave to Brenda from down the street, who had once received a $200 fine from Richard because her ceramic flower pots were the wrong shade of terracotta, and walked to the only empty folding chair left in the back row. At the front of the room, sitting behind a long plastic folding table, was Richard. He was in his element. He had upgraded from his usual polo shirt to a slightly wrinkled button-down, though he still wore the tight khaki shorts. His silver clipboard was resting perfectly parallel to the edge of the table. Sitting next to him was a gaunt, tired-looking man in a cheap gray suit. This had to be the HOA's legal counsel. The guy looked like he charged by the hour, but only got paid in neighborhood dues, and he was currently rubbing his temples like he already had a migraine. At exactly 8 p.m., Richard picked up a small wooden gavel, which I am almost certain he bought himself on Amazon just for these meetings, and banged it unnecessarily hard against the plastic table. "I call this emergency meeting of the Oak Creek Meadows Homeowners Association to order," Richard announced, his voice echoing too loudly through the cheap microphone on the table. He glared over the top of his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto me. "We are bypassing the standard reading of the minutes tonight to address a severe, unprecedented, and frankly unhinged violation of community standards." A collective murmur went through the crowd. "I guess we're skipping the pleasantries," I whispered to the guy sitting next to me, who was leaning forward so far he was practically falling out of his chair. "Mr. Jack," Richard barked, pointing a pen at me, "please step up to the front. We are not doing this from the back row." I casually stood up, took another sip of my sparkling water, and walked down the center aisle. The squeak of my sneakers on the linoleum floor was the only sound in the room. I stopped about 10 feet from the table, crossing my arms and giving Richard my best, most polite customer service smile. "Evening, Richard. Counsel?" I nodded to the lawyer. "What seems to be the emergency?" Richard's face instantly flushed that dangerous, blotchy red. "Do not play coy with me. You know exactly what the emergency is. This past Saturday, you orchestrated a massive, unauthorized, and highly destructive industrial operation on your property. You brought in 9 commercial tanker trucks and pumped 50,000 gallons of water directly into the foundation of your home." "I did," I agreed cheerfully. "It went very smoothly, honestly. The trucks were gone by 1 in the afternoon." "You built an indoor swimming pool without a permit," Richard yelled, slamming his hand on the table. "You bypassed the Architectural Review Committee. You violated Bylaw 4B regarding unauthorized water containment vessels. You endangered the structural integrity of the entire neighborhood by risking a foundational sinkhole. I had to call the police on you." "And what did the police say, Richard?" I asked calmly, letting the question hang in the air. Richard's jaw worked furiously, but no sound came out. I turned to the crowd, projecting my voice so everyone could hear. "For the record, the Plano Police Department inspected my property on Saturday afternoon. They verified that all structural work was permitted by the city, signed off by a licensed commercial engineer, and deemed 100% safe. They left 5 minutes later because, as they put it, I hadn't broken a single law." The crowd started whispering again. The lawyer in the gray suit leaned over and whispered something furiously into Richard's ear. Richard swatted him away. "The police don't enforce HOA bylaws," Richard yelled, his voice cracking slightly. "We enforce the bylaws, and you are in direct violation of the residential nature of this community. This board has convened tonight to levy a formal, non-negotiable fine of $10,000 against your property for unauthorized structural modification and unapproved recreational water installation. Furthermore, we are filing an injunction to force you to drain that basement within 48 hours, or we will place a lien on your house." Gasps echoed around the room. $10,000 was the nuclear option. The HOA had never fined anyone more than $500 before. Brenda looked like she was about to pass out. $10,000, I repeated, acting like I was mulling it over. "And an injunction. That is a very aggressive legal strategy, Richard. Did your counsel here advise you to do that?" I looked directly at the lawyer. The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat and cleared his throat. He pulled the microphone toward himself. "Mr. Jack," the lawyer said, his voice smooth and practiced. "My name is Arthur Vance, representing the board. Look, we understand you went through a lot of trouble, but the bylaws are a binding legal contract. Section 4, paragraph 2 clearly states that any modifications that alter the fundamental residential nature of the dwelling require prior written approval. A 50,000-gallon indoor swimming pool is not standard residential use. It falls under commercial or high-risk recreational zoning. The board has the right to enforce the removal of non-compliant structures." "It's a pool," Richard chimed in, pointing his pen at me again. "A massive illegal pool. I saw you carrying a giant inflatable pink flamingo out of your garage last week. You don't buy a flamingo unless you're building a pool." I couldn't help it. I actually laughed out loud. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "I mean, Richard, first of all, investigating my garage purchases is incredibly weird. But second of all, you are both missing a very crucial, very fundamental piece of information." I stepped forward and placed my thin manila folder on the plastic table, right between Richard and Arthur Vance. "Open it," I said to the lawyer. Arthur Vance frowned, adjusted his glasses, and flipped open the folder. Inside was a single piece of paper. It wasn't a city permit, it wasn't an engineering schematic. It was a printed page from the official Texas State Legislature website. "What is this?" Richard demanded, trying to read the paper upside down. "That," I said, projecting my voice so the back row could hear every single syllable, "is Title 11, Chapter 202, Section 202.007 of the Texas Property Code. I highly recommend you read it out loud for the board, Mr. Vance." The lawyer picked up the paper. His eyes scanned the first paragraph. I watched the exact moment the color drained completely out of his face. His eyes went wide, his mouth opened slightly, and he stopped breathing for a solid 3 seconds. "Well?" Richard snapped. "Read it. What does it say about unpermitted pools?" Arthur Vance slowly lowered the paper. He didn't look at Richard. He looked at me, a mixture of horror and absolute professional respect dawning in his eyes. He leaned into the microphone, his voice noticeably quieter than before. "The statute states that a property owners association may not include or enforce a provision in a dedicatory instrument that prohibits or restricts a property owner from installing rainwater harvesting systems or water storage systems for domestic use." The room was dead silent. "I don't understand," Richard said, blinking rapidly. "What does that have to do with his pool?" "I don't have a pool, Richard," I said, leaning over the table, bracing my hands on the cheap plastic. "As I told the police, and as my city permits explicitly state, I have installed a state-protected emergency drought resilience interior water storage cistern. It is designed to hold 50,000 gallons of potable water for domestic use in the event of a catastrophic grid failure or municipal drought." "That's a lie!" Richard screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "It has pool jets, it has a sand filter, it has underwater lighting. You were floating on a flamingo." "Does the Texas Property Code dictate the shape of a water storage system, Mr. Vance?" I asked, looking at the lawyer. Vance swallowed hard. "No." "Does it dictate the maximum volume?" "No." "Does the state of Texas forbid a homeowner from keeping their emergency water supply clean through the use of standard sand filtration and circulation jets?" It does not specify," Vance admitted, wiping sweat from his upper lip. "Does the state of Texas outlaw the use of waterproof LED lighting to monitor the clarity of a water storage system in a dark basement?" I pressed, stepping closer. "No." "And finally, Mr. Vance," I said, leaning in so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath, "is there any law in the great state of Texas that prevents a man from sitting on a plastic pink flamingo while inspecting his legally protected water storage system?" Vance stared at me. He looked down at the state statute, then back up at me. He reached over and turned off his microphone. "Richard," the lawyer whispered frantically, though the room was so quiet everyone in the first 3 rows could hear him perfectly. "He's right. The state legislature passed this to protect preppers and farmers. The language is incredibly broad. If you try to fine him for this, or if you try to put a lien on his house for a water storage system, you are violating state law." "I don't care," Richard hissed back, grabbing the microphone and turning it back on. "It's a loophole. It's a blatant abuse of the system. He's mocking us. He's making a mockery of the Oak Creek Meadows community standards." "I mean, honestly, Richard, the only one making a mockery of this community is the guy who tried to extort $500 from me over a kiddie pool," I said, turning to face the crowd. "Let's be very clear about what's happening here. The HOA bylaws state, I cannot have an above-ground water vessel on the exterior of my property. I complied. I removed it. The HOA bylaws say absolutely nothing about the interior of my property, and even if they did, state law supersedes HOA bylaws." I turned back to the table, looking dead into Richard's eyes. "If you issue that $10,000 fine, Richard, my lawyer will file a lawsuit against this HOA tomorrow morning for malicious prosecution, harassment, and intentional violation of the Texas Property Code. We will seek compensatory damages, punitive damages, and full coverage of my attorney's fees. And since the HOA insurance policy likely won't cover deliberate, illegal acts committed by the board president, that money is going to have to come out of the Community Reserve Fund. The crowd erupted. "The Reserve Fund!" Brenda shrieked from the third row, standing up. "That's our money! We're saving that to repave the tennis courts!" "You better not touch our money, Richard," a guy in a baseball cap yelled from the back. "He's acting like a dictator," another woman shouted. The entire room turned on him in a matter of seconds. It was beautiful. All the pent-up frustration from years of passive-aggressive citations, the tape-measured grass, the petty fines over garbage cans left out an hour too late. It all just boiled over. People were standing up, pointing fingers, yelling at the front table. Richard was panicking. He started banging his wooden gavel repeatedly. "Order! I demand order! We are the board! We make the rules!" Arthur Vance, the lawyer, slowly stood up. He snapped his briefcase shut, picked up the manila folder with the Texas statute in it, and looked down at Richard. "Arthur, what are you doing?" Richard pleaded, his eyes wide. Tell them we have the legal high ground." "Richard," Vance said into the microphone, his voice ringing out over the angry crowd. "I strongly advise the board to drop all pending actions against Mr. Jack. Furthermore, as of this moment, I am officially resigning as legal counsel for the Oak Creek Meadows Homeowners Association. Good luck." Vance stepped out from behind the table and walked straight down the center aisle, disappearing out the double-glass doors. Richard was left completely alone at the table. He looked at the empty chair next to him. He looked at the angry mob of his own neighbors. He looked at me. His lower lip was actually trembling. The aluminum clipboard sitting perfectly parallel to the edge of the table suddenly looked very, very small. Meeting adjourned," Richard stammered into the microphone. He didn't even use the gavel. He just stood up, grabbed his clipboard, and practically sprinted for the side exit, his orthotics squeaking frantically all the way out the door. The room erupted into cheers. Literally, people were clapping. Brenda pushed her way to the front of the room and grabbed my arm. "Jack," she said, her eyes shining with absolute delight. "That was the greatest thing I have ever seen in my entire life. Are you really going to sue him?" "Only if he sends the fine, Brenda," I smiled. "But I don't think he's going to be sending any more citations for a while." "Hey, man," the guy in the baseball cap said, clapping me on the shoulder. "So, about this cistern. How big did you say it was?" 50,000 gallons, I said casually. "And it has LED lights?" Brenda asked. "It does. It glows in the dark." The guy in the baseball cap looked around, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Listen, buddy. It's supposed to hit 106 degrees this weekend. If I bring over a case of imported beer and some steaks for the grill, any chance I can come inspect your drought-resilient system?" I laughed, looking around at the circle of neighbors who were all suddenly looking at me with intense, hopeful expressions. "Tell you what," I said loudly so everyone could hear. "This Saturday afternoon, I will be conducting an open house inspection of the emergency water storage facility. The front door will be open. BYOB. But please, no glass near the cistern. We wouldn't want to violate any safety protocols." The crowd cheered again. I walked out of that community center feeling like a conquering hero. The oppressive Texas heat hitting me in the parking lot didn't even bother me anymore. A week later, things had completely changed in Oak Creek Meadows. Richard had essentially become a ghost. He stepped down as HOA president 2 days after the meeting, citing health reasons, and I hadn't seen him or his silver clipboard walking the neighborhood since. The citations stopped entirely. People were leaving their trash cans out overnight. Kids were drawing with chalk on the sidewalks. It was absolute anarchy, and it was glorious. As for me, I am currently sitting in the dark, cool expanse of my basement. The electric blue LEDs are on, painting the concrete walls with rippling, aquatic light. The heavy hum of the commercial sand filter is vibrating gently through the floor. I'm floating in the exact center of my 50,000-gallon cistern on a giant pink flamingo. I just had Tommy come back and help me mount a massive 65-inch waterproof television to the primary, load-bearing pillar. I've got a cold drink in one hand, the waterproof remote in the other, and I am watching a movie while floating underneath my own living room. I mean, I guess Richard was right about one thing. Rules really are rules. But if you're going to play the game, you might as well learn how to use the rule book to build yourself an indoor lake. Have fun with this one. It's a ride.